Number 1. Chris Watts. On the morning of August 13th, 2018, a neighbor's doorbell camera captured something that, at the time, looked completely ordinary. Chris Watts loading boxes into his truck, moving calmly, methodically, almost cheerfully. His pregnant wife and 2 young daughters were nowhere to be seen. Within 48 hours, the entire world would understand why. Chris Watts grew up in Spring Lake, North Carolina, raised in a quiet, working-class household, by most accounts. And he was unremarkable in the best possible way. Polite, steady, the kind of man who kept to himself and didn't cause problems. He relocated to Frederick, Colorado, took a job as an oil field operator for Anadarko Petroleum, and built what appeared, from the outside, to be a picture-perfect life. He married Shanann Ruchek in 2012. Together they had 2 daughters, Bella, born in 2013, and Celeste, born in 2015. By the summer of 2018, Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child, and a boy they had already named Nico. Friends described Shanann as the magnetic one, vibrant, expressive, a prolific presence on Facebook, where she regularly posted family videos, birthday celebrations, and updates about her pregnancy. The Watts family seemed like exactly what they posted, happy, loving, and completely normal. But behind the filtered photos, the marriage was fracturing. Chris Watts had been carrying on a months-long affair with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger. By August 2018, he reportedly wanted out of the marriage entirely. But he didn't want the complications that came with it. No divorce, no custody dispute, no financial fallout. What he wanted, investigators would later conclude, was a clean slate. Shanann returned home from a work trip in the early hours of August 13, 2018. She had been away for 5 weeks. She walked into her own home just after 2 a.m. Oh, what happened inside that house in the hours that followed would become one of the most dissected true crime cases of the decade. When Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson couldn't reach her the next morning, Shanann had missed a doctor's appointment and wasn't answering calls. She drove to the house and contacted police. Officers arrived and conducted a welfare check. Nothing seemed overtly wrong, but Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Shanann's unborn son were all gone. Chris Watts agreed to speak with investigators on camera that same day. He stood on his front lawn and told local news reporters that he desperately wanted his family back. He looked directly into the cameras, his voice calm, his expression arranged into something resembling grief. He said he hoped Shanann had taken some time for herself. He said he didn't know where they were, and he said it all while his wife and daughters were already dead. The FBI, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the Frederick Police Department descended on the case almost immediately. Cell phone records showed Shanann's phone had gone dark inside the house. A neighbor's security footage placed Chris's company truck leaving the property at 5:27 a.m. on August 13th, with something in the back. Investigators executed a search of the Anadarko oil field site where Chris worked. What they found there on August 15th, just 2 days after Shanann was reported missing, ended the search. Shanann's body had been buried in a shallow grave near one of the oil tanks. Bella and Celeste had been concealed inside the tanks themselves. All 3 had been there since the morning Chris drove to work. Chris Watts was arrested that same evening. During an emotionally charged interview with investigators, footage that has since been viewed tens of millions of times, he initially tried to blame Shanann for the deaths of the girls. The story collapsed within hours. On November 6, 2018, rather than face trial and the possibility of the death penalty, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn Nico, as well as additional charges including unlawful termination of a pregnancy. The sentencing hearing was brief and devastating. Shanann's father, Frank Rzucek, addressed his son-in-law directly in court. He told him he took everything. Shanann's mother, Sandra, followed. The courtroom was silent in a way that press pool reporters said felt different from other hearings. Heavier, more final. Judge Marcelo Kopkow sentenced Chris Watts to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 84 years. Chris Watts is currently incarcerated at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a transfer that was made after he reportedly feared for his safety in Colorado prisons. In 2019, He agreed to a lengthy recorded interview with investigators in which he gave a more detailed, and in some places contradictory, account of what happened that night. Portions of that interview were later obtained and released publicly. In 2020, Netflix released a documentary titled American Murder: The Family Next Door, constructed almost entirely from Shanann's own social media videos, alongside police footage and court documents. It became one of the platform's most watched true crime films. The case remains a defining moment in how domestic violence, social media, and the performance of grief intersect in the public eye. Chris Watts didn't just destroy his family, he did it quietly, efficiently, and then stood in front of cameras and asked the world to feel sorry for him. He is 37 years old. He will die in prison. And if you think the betrayal hiding behind a calm face ends there, wait until you hear what unfolded inside a Colorado movie theater just 6 years earlier. In number 2, James Holmes. There were 400 people inside Theater 9 at the Century 16 Multiplex in Aurora, Colorado, on the night of July 20th, 2012. They had come for a midnight premiere. They had come for entertainment. Not one of them had any reason to believe they were sitting in the last place they would ever feel safe. James Egan Holmes was, by every measurable academic standard, extraordinary. Born on December 13, 1987, in San Diego, California, he was raised in a stable, an upper-middle-class household by 2 educated parents. His father, a mathematician, his mother, a nurse. He was quiet growing up, disciplined, and intensely focused on science. He graduated from the University of California, Riverside, in 2010 with the highest honors. A bachelor's degree in neuroscience, a field that studies, among other things, the mechanics of human thought and behavior. And he earned a spot in the prestigious PhD neuroscience program at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus in Denver. His professors recalled a student of uncommon potential, but something was unraveling beneath the surface of that resume, and it had been for years. Holmes had a long, largely undisclosed history of mental health struggles. He had seen multiple therapists. In the months leading up to July 2012, his academic performance had begun to collapse. In June 2012, just weeks before the attack, he failed a critical oral exam and submitted paperwork to withdraw from the program. A door that had defined his identity had just closed permanently. What Holmes did next was not impulsive, it was the opposite. Over the course of several months, he spent approximately $15,000 legally purchasing firearms, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and tactical equipment. All of it acquired through lawful channels without triggering a single red flag. Now he transformed his Aurora apartment into a carefully constructed trap, rigging it with tripwires, incendiary devices, and enough explosive material that investigators later said it could have leveled the building. He had booby-trapped it to detonate when police arrived, presumably while he was already at the theater. On the night of July 19th into the early hours of July 20th, 2012, Holmes arrived at the Century 16 Multiplex dressed in full tactical gear, a ballistic helmet, a gas mask, a throat protector, body armor, and tactical pants. He entered through an emergency exit door he had propped open earlier in the evening. He released canisters of tear gas into the packed theater, and then he opened fire with a semi-automatic rifle, a shotgun, and a handgun on a crowd that, for several seconds, thought the chaos was part of the movie experience. 12 people were killed, 70 others were wounded, making it one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history at the time. The youngest victim was 6 years old. The oldest was 51. Among the dead was a young woman named Jessica Gowell, a sports journalist who had narrowly escaped a shopping mall shooting in Toronto just 1 month earlier. Among the survivors was a man named Caleb Medley, shot in the face, who was in a coma for weeks while his wife gave birth to their first child down the hall in the same hospital. Holmes was apprehended within minutes of the attack, standing beside his car in the theater parking lot. He did not resist. He reportedly told officers there were explosives in his apartment. Aurora police later described his demeanor as eerily detached, cooperative in a way that felt mechanical rather than remorseful. The trial of James Holmes began in April 2015 and became the longest, most expensive criminal proceeding in Colorado history. Over 9,000 potential jurors were summoned during the selection process alone. If the central question was not whether Holmes had committed the killings, That was never in dispute. The question was whether he was legally sane at the time. His defense team argued that Holmes was in the grip of a severe psychotic episode, disconnected from the moral reality of what he was doing. The prosecution argued he had planned methodically over months, demonstrating clear awareness and calculated intent. Holmes's courtroom appearances became internationally known. As he arrived at multiple hearings with dyed orange hair, wide, unfocused eyes, and expressions that oscillated between blank detachment and something harder to describe, something that seemed deliberately unreadable. Press photographs from those appearances circulated globally within hours. Survivors testified in devastating detail. Family members of the deceased addressed Holmes directly. One father told him that he hoped Holmes would think about what he had done every single day for the rest of his life. Holmes showed almost no visible reaction throughout. The jury rejected the insanity defense on July 16, 2015. James Holmes was found guilty on all 165 counts against him, including 24 counts of first-degree murder, counting both intent and extreme indifference theories for each victim, plus attempted murder and explosives charges. The sentencing phase required the jury to decide unanimously between execution and life in prison. They could not reach unanimity on the death penalty and under Colorado law, that meant life was the mandatory outcome. On August 26, 2015, Judge Carlos Samur sentenced James Holmes to 12 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 3,318 years. The judge read every count aloud. The sentencing took hours. Holmes is currently held at the Colorado State Penitentiary, a maximum security facility. He has filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. His apartment was demolished shortly after the attack. The Century 16 multiplex was later torn down and rebuilt as a different theater. A memorial garden now stands nearby. The Aurora Theater massacre reshaped the national conversation around mass shootings, security at public venues, and the limits of existing mental health reporting systems. The weapons used were all legally obtained. Every permit was valid. Every background check was passed. 12 people never came home from a movie. And if you think calculated, long-planned violence was confined to a single Colorado city in 2012. The next case will prove that nowhere, not even the most ordinary of workplaces, was ever truly off limits. Number 3, Nathan Dunlap. Most people, when they lose a job, go home angry. They complain to a friend, maybe lose a few nights of sleep, and eventually move on. Nathan Dunlap went back. Nathan James Dunlap was born on November 17, 1973, in Aurora, Colorado. He grew up in a household marked by instability, a childhood that, by most accounts, offered very little in the way of structure or consistent support. He was described by those who knew him as restless and socially difficult, someone who struggled to hold relationships together and had trouble managing frustration. He was 19 years old in the fall of 1993. He drifting without much direction when he landed a job at a Chuck E. Cheese restaurant on East Hampton Avenue in Aurora. It was an entry-level position, the kind of job that most people his age treated as temporary. For Dunlap, it was something to hold on to. He didn't hold it long. At some point in the weeks leading up to December 1993, Dunlap was fired. The exact circumstances of his termination were never publicly elaborated upon in significant detail. But what investigators and prosecutors would later establish was that Dunlap did not let it go. He brooded, he planned. And sometime before closing time on the night of December 14, 1993, he made a decision that would define every remaining year of his life. The Chuck E. Cheese location on East Hampton Avenue closed to customers that evening as usual. 5 employees remained inside to clean up and close out the registers, a routine that happened every single night without incident. The youngest among them was 17-year-old Sylvia Crowell. The others were Ben Grant, 19, Colleen O'Connor, 17, Margaret Kohlberg, 50, and Bobby Stevens, 20. Dunlap had been inside the restaurant earlier that evening as a customer, waiting. He concealed himself in the building as it closed. Once the employees were locked inside and the lights had been dimmed, he emerged with a handgun. What followed was methodical and devastating. He shot each of the 5 employees at close range. 4 of them, Ben Grant, Colleen O'Connor, Sylvia Crowell, and Margaret Kohlberg died at the scene. Bobby Stevens, though critically wounded, survived by lying still and convincing Dunlap he was already dead. That decision, to play dead and not move, not breathe audibly, not react, saved his life and ultimately helped convict the man who shot him. Dunlap left the restaurant with roughly $1,500 from the registers. He was 19 years old, and he had just killed 4 people at a children's entertainment venue over a lost job. The investigation moved quickly, in part because of how traceable Dunlap was. He had been a former employee. Witnesses placed him inside the restaurant earlier in the evening. Bobby Stevens, once recovered enough to speak, provided a first-hand account to investigators. Physical evidence from the scene connected back to Dunlap with directness that left little room for alternative suspects. He was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and aggravated robbery. The trial in 1994 drew significant local attention, though the national media landscape of the time meant it didn't reach the saturation that similar cases would receive a decade later. Prosecutors laid out a precise, evidence-driven case, the timeline of Dunlap hiding inside the restaurant, the robbery, the witness testimony from Stevens, and the physical evidence recovered from the scene. The defense acknowledged Dunlap's involvement, but argued for mitigating circumstances related to his background and mental state. The jury was unconvinced. Nathan Dunlap was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death in 1996. He was placed on Colorado's death row, where he would spend the next 3 decades at the center of one of the state's most prolonged and politically charged capital punishment debates. And that is where the story becomes something more complicated than a simple sentencing and a closed chapter. Over the years that followed, Dunlap's case became a recurring flashpoint in Colorado politics, precisely because the death penalty itself was a recurring flashpoint. Multiple governors were asked to weigh in. In 2013, Governor John Hickenlooper granted Dunlap an indefinite reprieve, not a commutation, not a pardon, but a suspension of the execution, citing deep personal reservations about the death penalty system and stating publicly that he was uncomfortable with the irreversibility of execution in a system capable of error. The decision was politically explosive. Victims' families expressed profound anguish. Advocates on both sides used Dunlap's case as a focal point for years of legislative debate. The resolution came not through a single dramatic courtroom moment, but through a legislative one. In March 2020, Colorado Governor Jared Polis signed a bill abolishing the death penalty in the state entirely, making Colorado the 22nd state to do so. As part of that change, the 3 inmates then on Colorado's death row, including Nathan Dunlap, had their sentences automatically commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A 24-year death sentence, politically debated by 2 governors, and survived by circumstance rather than by any judicial finding of innocence or error. Nathan Dunlap is currently serving life without parole in a Colorado correctional facility. Bobby Stevens, the sole survivor whose quiet courage in the darkness of that restaurant helped bring Dunlap to justice, has spoken publicly over the years about the lasting weight of that night. The families of the 4 victims have attended hearings, legislative debates, and press conferences across 3 decades, still present, still asking to be remembered, still waiting for a finality that the legal system has never quite delivered to them cleanly. The Chuck E. Cheese case remains one of Colorado's most quietly haunting criminal stories, not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. A dismissal, a grudge. 4 lives ended inside a place designed to make children laugh. And if you think the line between ideology and violence has ever been easy to identify before the moment it's crossed, the next case will complicate that assumption in ways that are still playing out in courtrooms today. Number 4, Robert Deere. The call came in at 11:38 a.m. on November 27, 2015, Thanksgiving Day. And for the next 5 hours and 23 minutes, a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs became the center of a standoff that left 3 people dead, 9 wounded, and as in an entire city holding its breath. Robert Lewis. Deere Jr. was not a man who appeared on anyone's radar as an imminent threat. And that, in retrospect, is precisely what made him dangerous. Born on April 3, 1958 in Charleston, South Carolina, Deere lived the kind of fragmented, itinerant life that leaves few clean records and fewer reliable witnesses. He moved frequently across multiple states, North Carolina, Georgia, all Colorado, living at various points in rural cabins and remote properties, largely off the grid. He had a history of domestic disturbances, complaints from neighbors, and brushes with law enforcement that never culminated in serious charges. Those who had known him over the years described someone volatile, deeply suspicious of government, and intensely religious in an idiosyncratic, self-constructed way that bore little resemblance to any organized doctrine. By 2015, A. Deer was living in a remote property in Park County, Colorado, a converted shed on a rural lot with no running water. He was 57 years old, largely isolated, and, according to investigators who later reviewed his background in exhaustive detail, had been consuming anti-abortion media and rhetoric with increasing intensity. He had made statements to acquaintances about Planned Parenthood in the months before the attack. Those statements, at the time, were not taken as credible warning signs. They would later be entered into evidence. On the morning of November 27, 2015, Deer drove to the Planned Parenthood clinic on Centennial Boulevard in Colorado Springs, armed with a rifle and propane tanks. He opened fire in the parking lot before forcing his way inside the building. The attack unfolded across a sprawling exterior and interior space, making it extraordinarily difficult for first responders to establish a perimeter and locate the shooter. And officers from the Colorado Springs Police Department arrived almost immediately and came under fire. 3 people died: Kari Stewart, a 29-year-old Iraq War veteran; Jennifer Markovsky, 35, who had accompanied a friend to the clinic; and University of Colorado Springs police officer Garrett Swayze, 44, who responded to assist, even though the clinic was outside his jurisdiction. He did not have to go. He went anyway. 9 others were wounded, including several law enforcement officers. The standoff continued for hours as SWAT teams worked to move civilians to safety and attempt to communicate with Deer, who had barricaded himself inside. He surrendered shortly after 5 p.m. He walked out without resistance. What he said after his arrest would echo through every subsequent legal proceeding. During his initial interview with investigators, Deer made statements that were direct, ideological, and deeply incriminating. Therein he referenced baby parts, an allusion to a heavily edited and widely circulated undercover video series released months earlier that alleged Planned Parenthood had been illegally selling fetal tissue. He described himself as acting in defense of unborn children. Investigators noted he showed no remorse and appeared, if anything, satisfied with what he had done. Prosecutors charged Deer with 179 counts, including first-degree murder, attempted murder, and assault. A case of this magnitude, and under normal circumstances, would have proceeded to one of the largest trials in Colorado history. But the legal process that followed has been anything but normal, and that is where this case takes a turn that no one fully anticipated. At Deer's first court appearance, he erupted. He stood up in the courtroom and announced that he was a warrior for the babies, shouting over his own attorneys and the judge before he could be quieted. It was the first of many such outbursts, and it was broadcast live. In subsequent hearings, Deer fired his attorneys, accused his legal team of conspiring against him, screamed ideological declarations from the defense table, and repeatedly disrupted proceedings in ways that forced recesses and raised immediate questions about his mental competency. Court-ordered psychiatric evaluations concluded repeatedly, and that Deer was not competent to stand trial, meaning he could not meaningfully understand the proceedings against him or assist in his own defense. Under Colorado law, that determination placed him in a legal holding pattern. He was committed to the Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo for treatment and periodic reevaluation. He has been found incompetent not once, but multiple times over the course of nearly a decade. As of the most recent evaluations available, Deer remains in that legal limbo. Never tried, never convicted, never acquitted. The families of Garrett Swayze, Kari Stewart, and Jennifer Markovsky have waited for a trial that has not come. Officer Swayze's children grew up without their father, while the man who killed him has spent years in a mental health facility rather than a courtroom. Survivor testimony, law enforcement accounts, and Deer's own incriminating statements have all been gathered, documented, and preserved, and none of it has yet been tested before a jury. Robert Deere is currently in his late 60s. The legal process continues to grind forward in fits and starts, with evaluations scheduled and rescheduled, and rulings challenged and reconsidered. Whether he will ever stand trial in any conventional sense remains, after nearly a decade, genuinely uncertain. 3 people died on a holiday because one man decided his convictions entitled him to end their lives. One of them drove to a building that wasn't even in his jurisdiction because someone needed help. That choice alone says more about who was heroic in Colorado Springs that November than anything that has happened in a courtroom since. And if you think waiting a decade for justice sounds like an anomaly in Colorado, the next case involves a fiancé, a disappearance, and a crime so methodically concealed that the truth only came out because of a woman who decided she had heard enough. May number 5, Patrick Frazee. She was supposed to be home by dinner. Kelsey Barrett had been seen at a Woodland Park Safeway on Thanksgiving Day, November 22nd, 2018, shopping with her 1-year-old daughter, Kaylee. Security footage captured them clearly. A young mother and her baby, doing something completely unremarkable on a holiday afternoon. That footage would become the last confirmed public sighting of Kelsey Barrett alive. She was 29 years old. Kelsey Barrett grew up in Gooding, Idaho, and in a close-knit family that described her as determined and disciplined from an early age. She earned her private pilot's license before most of her peers had finished college, eventually becoming a certified flight instructor based out of Woodland Park, Colorado. She was methodical, safety-conscious by professional instinct, and by all accounts deeply devoted to her daughter. She and Patrick Frazee had been engaged since 2017. They shared custody of Kaylee, though they did not live together. From the outside, the arrangement appeared functional, if unconventional. Patrick Frazee was a rancher, physically imposing, locally respected, the kind of man who seemed completely at home in the rugged landscape of Teller County. He had grown up around livestock and land, and he projected the steady, capable image of someone who had his life under control. Few people in his community had any reason to look at Patrick Frazee and see something other than what he presented. But Patrick Frazee had a secret. For months before Kelsey disappeared, he had been conducting an affair with an Idaho woman named Crystal Lee, and the relationship between Frazee and Lee was not simply romantic. According to what Lee would later tell investigators, in extraordinary disturbing detail, Frazee had approached her on multiple occasions with a request that went far beyond infidelity. He had asked her, repeatedly and explicitly, to kill Kelsey Barrett. He had suggested methods, and now he had offered justifications. Lee had not reported these conversations to law enforcement. She had not acted on them either, but she had not walked away. When Kelsey failed to appear for work on November 25, 2018, and stopped responding to all communication, her employer flagged the absence. Her family, based in Idaho, grew alarmed when days passed without contact. A wellness check at her Woodland Park townhouse found her dog inside, alone, with the animal's food and water depleted. Then Kelsey's phone had last pinged a cell tower in Idaho on November 25th, but her family had received no calls, no visits, nothing. The phone signal would later prove to be one of the most critical threads in the entire investigation. Patrick Frazee was, predictably, among the first people law enforcement contacted. He said he had last seen Kelsey on Thanksgiving Day at her townhouse when he dropped Kaylee off for a visit. He expressed appropriate-sounding concern. He cooperated, on the surface, with initial inquiries. But investigators with the Woodland Park Police Department and the FBI noticed inconsistencies almost immediately. Small things, the kind of details that don't match up when a story has been constructed rather than remembered. Then Crystal Lee made a decision that changed everything. Facing her own legal exposure, she had, among other things, used Kelsey's phone after Kelsey was already dead to send texts designed to make Kelsey appear alive. Lee agreed to cooperate with investigators, and she didn't just cooperate. She agreed to wear a wire and record her conversations with Patrick Frazee directly. What those recordings captured was extraordinary and deeply disturbing. Frazee spoke candidly, confirming details of what had happened, providing information that only the perpetrator could know, and demonstrating a calculated awareness of the investigation closing in around him. The recordings became the backbone of the prosecution's case, evidence so direct and so damning that defense attorneys had virtually no foundation on which to build a credible counter-narrative. According to the evidence presented at trial, Frazee had gone to Kelsey's townhouse on Thanksgiving Day after she returned from the Safeway. He attacked her inside her own home, killing her with a baseball bat. He then contacted Crystal Lee and had her come to the residence to assist with cleaning the scene. Kelsey's remains were transported to Frazee's ranch in Teller County, where he burned them in a burn pile on his property. Her remains were so thoroughly destroyed that investigators, despite extensive searching of the ranch and surrounding areas, were never able to recover them. Kelsey Barrett's body has never been found. In that absence, the complete destruction of physical remains was central to why this case was so difficult to prosecute and why it took as long as it did. Law enforcement had a missing woman, a suspicious fiancé, a cooperating witness with serious credibility challenges of her own, and recorded conversations that were damning but required context to fully interpret. Prosecutors moved forward anyway, but they charged Patrick Frazee in December 2018, within weeks of Kelsey's disappearance, with first-degree murder and solicitation of murder. The trial began in November 2019. Crystal Lee was the prosecution's anchor witness. She testified in detail about the multiple occasions on which Frazee had solicited her to kill Kelsey, about what happened after Thanksgiving Day, and about her own role in the aftermath. Her credibility was aggressively attacked by the defense, Naeem, who argued she was a self-interested cooperating witness, shaping her testimony to secure a plea deal, which she had in fact received in exchange for her cooperation. She ultimately pleaded guilty to tampering with physical evidence and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. But the wire recordings spoke in ways that cross-examination could not fully neutralize. The jury deliberated and returned guilty verdicts on all counts, first-degree murder and 2 counts of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. On December 13, 2019, Judge Scott Sells sentenced Patrick Frazee to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no visible emotion at sentencing. He has maintained his silence publicly ever since, never providing investigators with the location of Kelsey's remains. Kaylee Barrett, the daughter Kelsey was photographed with in that Safeway security footage on the last afternoon of her mother's life, was taken in by Kelsey's parents in Idaho. She is being raised by her maternal grandparents. Patrick Frazee will spend the rest of his life in a Colorado correctional facility, the only person who knows exactly where Kelsey's remains are, and he has chosen every single day since his arrest to keep that to himself. Kelsey Barrett's family has continued to search. They have asked publicly, repeatedly, for Frazee to come forward with information about where their daughter is. He has not. Some crimes end with a verdict, some end with a sentence, and some leave a door permanently open because the one person who could close it decided that silence was the last form of control he had left. And if you think the destruction of evidence can fully erase a crime from the public record, the next case involves a shooter, a grocery store, no-end footage so widely broadcast that there was nowhere left to hide. Number 6. Ahmad al-Aliwi Alisa. The video spread across the internet within minutes of being filmed. A man in tactical gear, shirtless, bleeding from a wound on his leg, being led out of a King Soopers grocery store in Boulder, Colorado by law enforcement officers. 10 people were already dead inside. The whole encounter had lasted less than an hour. And the man being walked out in handcuffs had a name that investigators already had on file because someone who knew him had flagged him to law enforcement years earlier. Ahmad al-Aliwi. Alisa was born in Syria in 1999 and came to the United States as a young child, growing up in the Denver suburb of Arvada, Colorado. He attended Arvada West High School, where he wrestled competitively, a sport that demands discipline, physical conditioning, and mental resilience. He was not a ghost. He was known to his classmates, his coaches, his community. But the version of Ahmad Alisa that his peers observed in those years was already, by multiple accounts, a source of concern. Former classmates and acquaintances described a young man who was deeply disproportionately reactive to perceived slights. He had accused classmates of making anti-Muslim comments on occasions that others present said had not occurred. Yeah, he had a documented altercation in 2017 in which he attacked a fellow student, resulting in a misdemeanor assault conviction. People who knew him described someone whose internal world seemed to operate under a constant state of threat. Someone who perceived hostility in situations where others perceived nothing at all. A family member told investigators that Alyssa had long expressed beliefs consistent with paranoid thinking, and that the family had been worried about his mental state for years. In 2019, a man who said he knew Alyssa personally contacted the FBI's to report concerns about him. Specifically, concerns that Alyssa had expressed thoughts about conducting a violent attack. The FBI investigated, found insufficient basis to take further action, and closed the inquiry. It was a decision that, in the aftermath of March 22nd, 2021, would be examined with the full, painful clarity of hindsight. And in the months leading up to the attack, Alyssa had been active on social media in ways that, reviewed afterward, pointed towards someone increasingly consumed by anger and grievance. He had purchased a Ruger AR-556 pistol, a weapon specifically designed to replicate the functionality of an assault-style rifle while meeting legal definitions that made it purchasable under Colorado's existing laws, just 6 days before the shooting. That purchase window would later become a central point of debate in Colorado's legislative response. March 22, 2021 was a Monday. The King Soopers on Table Mesa Drive in Boulder was busy in the mid-afternoon, a neighborhood grocery store in a college town, the kind of place where people stop in after work or between classes. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Alyssa pulled into the parking lot and opened fire before he even entered the building. The attack moved from the parking lot to the store's interior, leaving no safe space for the people inside to simply run. The 10 people killed that afternoon were Denny Stong, 20, Nevin Stanisic, 23, Ricky Olds, 25, Trelona Bartkowiak, 49, Suzanne Fountain, 59, Terry Leaker, 51, Kevin Mahoney, 61, Lynn Murray, 62, Jody Waters, 65, and Boulder Police Officer Eric Talley, 51. Officer Talley was among the first responders to arrive on scene. He was a father of 7 children. He ran toward the sound of gunfire and was killed. He was 51 years old and had recently been exploring a career change. His wife later shared that he had been pursuing drone technology training in part because he had concerns about the dangers of frontline police work. He had gone anyway. He always went anyway. Security footage from inside the store captured portions of the attack and was later reviewed by investigators in exhaustive detail. Shoppers and employees hid in freezers, back rooms, OSH and storage areas while the shooting continued. Some escaped through emergency exits. Others sheltered in place and waited. The audio of gunfire, captured on phones by people hiding inside, was broadcast by news outlets worldwide within hours. Law enforcement converged on the store rapidly. A SWAT team made entry and moved through the building. At some point during the confrontation, Alyssa was struck by a bullet in the leg. He was taken into custody alive. He'd shirtless, having apparently removed his shirt at some point during the attack, and visibly wounded. The footage of his arrest, broadcast on live television and shared millions of times online, became one of the defining images of American mass shooting coverage in the modern era. Alyssa was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count for each victim, as well as attempted murder and a weapons charge. And then, in a sequence that will feel familiar to anyone who followed the Robert Deere case, the legal proceedings stalled. Court-ordered psychiatric evaluations determined that Alyssa was not competent to stand trial. He was committed to the Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo, the same facility where Robert Deere has been held, for treatment. Subsequent evaluations continued to find him incompetent. For 4 years, the case of the Boulder King Soopers shooting remained legally unresolved, its perpetrator alive and institutionalized, while the families of 10 victims attended hearings that never produced a trial. The Boulder shooting reignited the national debate around assault-style weapons, with an intensity that prompted direct legislative action in Colorado. Within weeks of the attack, Governor Jared Polis signed bills expanding background check requirements and allowing local governments to enact their own gun restrictions, measures that had been blocked in the state legislature for years. The weapon used at King Soopers, purchased legally 6 days before the attack, became a specific reference point in those legislative discussions. As of the most recent available reporting, Alyssa's competency status has been under continued review, with prosecutors and the court monitoring his treatment progress and the possibility of a trial remaining open. He has been held for years without a verdict, without a conviction, and without the formal legal accountability that the families of his victims have been waiting for since March of 2021. Eric Talley's children grew up knowing their father ran into a grocery store to protect strangers and did not come back out. Denny Stong's family buried a 20-year-old. Jody Waters, Mae Suzanne Fountain, Lynn Murray, ordinary people on an ordinary Monday afternoon, doing something as unremarkable as buying groceries, never made it home. 10 lives, erased in under an hour, in a building full of people who had no reason to think the day would end any way other than normally. And if you think a crime needs to happen quickly to leave a permanent scar on a city, the next case unfolded slowly across one long and brutal night, and left Denver with questions about justice, loyalty, and the cost of keeping secrets that it has never fully stopped asking. Number 7. Dexter Lewis. 5 people walked into work on the night of October 16, 2012, at a small neighborhood bar in Denver called Pharaoh's Bar and Grill. None of them walked out, and the man ultimately held responsible for their deaths was not acting alone, a fact that would make this case one of the most legally and morally tangled in Colorado history. Dexter Lewis was born in Denver in 1990. He grew up in circumstances that his defense attorneys would later describe at length during sentencing. A childhood marked by poverty, instability, and exposure to violence at an age when children should be insulated from it entirely. He had a criminal history by the time he was a young adult, and he moved through the city's margins in the company of people who operated well outside the law. None of that background excuses what happened at Pharaoh's Bar and Grill. But it is the landscape against which the events of that October night have to be understood. Pharaoh's was a modest establishment on East Colfax Avenue, the kind of local bar that anchors a neighborhood without calling much attention to itself. It was owned by a man named Joe Ricci, who had built the place into something his regulars considered genuinely theirs. On the night of October 16th, going into the early hours of October 17th, 2012, Ricci and 4 of his employees were inside closing up for the evening. The bar had wound down for the night. The doors were locked to the public. What should have been a routine end to an ordinary Tuesday was about to become something else entirely. Dexter Lewis arrived at Pharaoh's that night with 2 other men, his brother Linnell Lewis and a man named Joseph Hill. The stated intention, according to the evidence presented at trial, was robbery. They knew the bar would have cash from the evening's business. They knew the staff would be inside closing out the registers. What happened once they got inside was not, by any account, part of a coherent plan. It was something that unraveled fast, in the worst possible direction. Dexter Lewis produced a knife. What followed was not a robbery that turned violent in the heat of a single uncontrolled moment. It was a sustained, close-range attack that killed 5 people inside that building. Joe Ricci, the bar's owner, Kelleen Fallon, 44, Terriasa Beasley, 45, Ross Richter, 29, and Daria Pohl, 21. Each of them died inside a place that had been, just hours before, full of laughter and conversation and the ordinary noise of a neighborhood bar. After the attack, the building was set on fire with the bodies still inside, an act designed, prosecutors argued, to destroy evidence and obscure the scope of what had happened. The fire did not destroy enough. Well, here is where the Dexter Lewis case takes a turn that sets it apart from nearly every other case in this series, and arguably from most criminal cases in Colorado history. One of the men present at Pharaoh's Bar and Grill that night, Joseph Hill, was not simply a participant in the attack. Hill was a paid undercover informant working for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. He had been operating in that capacity for some time, embedded in the social network that included Dexter Lewis, reporting on criminal activity to his federal handlers. Hill reported the Pharaoh's attack to his ATF handlers within hours of it happening, and Joseph Hill was never charged. That revelation, when it emerged during the legal proceedings, sent shockwaves through the case and far beyond it. Prosecutors and federal authorities maintained that the decision not to charge Hill was a complex matter involving the mechanics and ethics of confidential informant programs. the evidentiary value of his cooperation, and the legal thresholds required for charges. Defense attorneys and commentators argued that a man who had been present during 5 murders and set a fire to conceal them had walked free because of who he worked for. That the debate over Hill's immunity became as much a part of the Dexter Lewis story as the trial itself. Lewis and his brother Linnell were both charged. Linnell Lewis ultimately reached a plea agreement in connection with the case. Dexter Lewis faced the full weight of the prosecution alone. And what the Denver District Attorney's Office brought against him was historic in its scope. And prosecutors sought the death penalty, making Lewis the first person in Denver in over a decade to face capital punishment. The jury selection process reflected the magnitude of the case. Nearly 600 potential jurors were summoned before a panel could be seated, one of the largest jury pools in Colorado history. The trial began in 2015. Prosecutors laid out the physical evidence from the fire scene, the forensic reconstruction of how each victim had died, and the testimony of witnesses who connected Lewis to the attack. The ATF informant situation hung over the proceedings throughout, acknowledged, documented, and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved in the justice system who had to address it publicly. Lewis's defense team presented extensive mitigation evidence during the penalty phase: his childhood, his environment, the circumstances that had shaped him before he ever set foot inside Pharaoh's. They argued that death was not the appropriate sentence even for crimes this severe. The jury weighed the aggravating and mitigating factors across days of deliberation. In the end, the jury could not unanimously agree on the death penalty. Under Colorado law, that deadlock meant the death sentence was automatically removed from consideration. Dexter Lewis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And his brother Linnell received a lesser sentence under the terms of his agreement. Joseph Hill, the federal informant who had been inside that building on the night of the attack, served no prison time related to the events at Pharaoh's Bar and Grill. Joe Ricci's bar was gone. The building on East Colfax, scorched and gutted, stood as a physical marker of what had happened there until it was eventually cleared. The families of the 5 victims navigated a legal process that delivered a verdict without ever fully resolving the deeper question of how a federally protected informant could be present at a mass killing and walk away without facing a single charge for it. Dexter Lewis is currently serving life without parole in a Colorado correctional facility. He was 22 years old when he entered Pharaoh's Bar and Grill on the night of October 16, 2012. He will spend every remaining year of his life behind bars. The 5 people he killed will remain permanently at whatever age they were on that Tuesday night. Young and middle-aged and older, all of them simply doing their jobs, all of them gone before the fire was even out. Justice in this case came with an asterisk that no one in the Denver legal community has ever fully been able to erase. Yes, and if you think the most haunting Colorado cases are the ones that ended in a courtroom, the next case involves a disappearance, a husband with a shovel, a rare animal tranquilizer found in human bones, and a trial that, as of right now, has not yet happened. Number 8, Suzanne Morphew. On Mother's Day, May 10, 2020, a woman went for a bike ride near her home in Chaffee County, Colorado, and never came back. What followed was not a straightforward missing persons case. It was a 5-year unraveling of secrets, misconduct, scientific discovery, and legal chaos that is still, as of this moment, not finished. Suzanne Morphew was 49 years old when she disappeared. She had grown up in Indiana, where she met Barry Morphew in high school. They married, raised 2 daughters together, and eventually relocated to Colorado, settling into a large, secluded home near the small community of Maysville in Chaffee County, a property backed by mountain wilderness, and at the kind of place that looks idyllic in photographs and feels remote in ways that become significant when something goes wrong. By outward appearances, the Morphews had built a comfortable life. Barry ran a successful landscaping business. The couple attended church. Their daughters were grown. Neighbors and acquaintances described a family that projected stability. What was happening behind that projection is a matter now being prepared for a jury to hear. Or Suzanne's bicycle was found near her home, not long after she was reported missing. Her helmet was with it. There was no Suzanne. Barry Morphew, who had been away on a work trip in Bennett, Colorado, when his wife disappeared, or so he said, returned home and immediately became the figure around whom the entire investigation would orbit. Investigators noted his behavior from the earliest days of the case. He posted emotional Facebook videos appealing for information about his wife's whereabouts. He spoke to local and national media. He cried publicly. He performed, in the precise clinical sense of that word, the role of a devastated husband. Law enforcement was not persuaded. The Chaffee County Sheriff's Office, working alongside the FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, began building a case around Barry Morphew almost immediately. Nice cell phone records placed him in the vicinity of Maysville on the morning of May 10th, contradicting his account of being hours away in Bennett at the time of his wife's disappearance. Investigators found evidence on his property that suggested recent digging. A neighbor reported seeing Barry's truck near the house on the morning Suzanne vanished. His search history, his communications, and his movements in the days surrounding May 10th were examined in granular detail. There was also the matter of the deer. Barry Morphew was an avid hunter. He had, in the period before Suzanne's disappearance, obtained and used a combination of drugs known informally as BAM, a cocktail of butorphanol, azapirone, and medetomidine, a powerful animal tranquilizer used in wildlife management to sedate deer and other large animals. The drugs are not easy to obtain, not commonly known outside hunting in veterinary circles, and not the kind of substance that appears in a typical household medicine cabinet. Barry had acknowledged using BAM in the context of hunting. Investigators noted the acknowledgement carefully and moved on. They would return to it. In May 2021, nearly a full year after Suzanne vanished, Barry Morphew was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, tampering with physical evidence, and attempting to influence a public servant, among other counts. The case proceeded without a body, without physical remains, without a confirmed cause of death. Prosecutors were building a circumstantial case of significant complexity, and they believed they had enough to take it to trial. They were wrong about the timing, though not in the way anyone expected. In April 2022, with the trial approaching, the case collapsed. Not because of anything the defense did in a courtroom, but because of what happened to the prosecutor outside of one. Though Chaffee County District Attorney Linda Stanley was disbarred by the Colorado Supreme Court for misconduct that included, among other violations, withholding evidence from the defense. The disbarment was directly connected to her handling of the Morphew case. The charges against Barry were dismissed without prejudice, meaning they could be refiled. But the case was, for the moment, over. Barry Morphew walked out of custody. The family of Suzanne Morphew, who had watched a year of proceedings with the quiet anguish of people waiting for acknowledgement of what they already knew, watched the man they believed had killed her walk free on a legal technicality rooted in prosecutorial failure. It was one of the most stunning reversals in Colorado criminal justice in recent memory. And then, in September 2023, a hiker in the mountains of Saguache County made a discovery. Human remains, partially exposed in a shallow grave in a remote area, were recovered and sent for analysis. The identification came back as Suzanne Morphew. She had been there, in that ground, for 3 years. The forensic analysis that followed was extraordinary. Investigators submitted bone samples for toxicological testing, a process that can, under specific conditions, detect the presence of certain compounds even in skeletal remains years after death. The results, released as part of a 2024 autopsy report, found traces of BAM in Suzanne Morphew's bones, in the same animal tranquilizer cocktail that Barry Morphew had acknowledged using to sedate deer, had been detected in the skeleton of his missing wife. The implications were immediate and seismic. Barry Morphew was re-indicted in June 2025 on charges of first-degree murder with deliberation, felony murder, and tampering with physical evidence. He was located in Arizona and arrested without significant incident. His bond was set and contested. His legal team began the process of preparing a defense for a case that now included physical remains, a forensic cause of death pathway, and toxicological evidence connecting a drug he had personally used to the body of the woman he had claimed to be desperately searching for. His trial is currently scheduled for October 2026. It has not yet happened. The outcome is not yet known. What is known is this: Suzanne Morphew left her house on Mother's Day to go for a bike ride. Her remains were found 3 years later in a shallow mountain grave. A rare sedative used to immobilize deer was found in her bones. And the man she married in high school, the man who wept on camera and asked the public to help find her, is currently in custody awaiting the trial that will determine whether he spends the rest of his life in prison. Chaffee County is a place of extraordinary natural beauty, big skies, mountain meadows, and the kind of landscape that draws people looking for peace and quiet and distance from the noise of the world. Suzanne Morphew loved it there. She had built a life there, and somewhere in that landscape, in a place she almost certainly never intended to be, she spent 3 years waiting to be found. She has been found. The rest of the story is still being written. And if you think the most extraordinary Colorado cases are the ones that end in clear verdicts and unambiguous justice, the last case in this series involves a young woman who was already in handcuffs when the crime she was convicted of occurred, and a writer named Hunter S. Thompson who decided that was not something the world should be allowed to ignore. Number 9, Liesl Ullman. She was in the back of a police car, handcuffed, when the shooting happened. She could not have pulled a trigger. She could not have run. She could not have intervened, escaped, or done anything other than sit exactly where she was. And yet, under Colorado law, a jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, and a judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before explaining how that was legally possible, it is worth being clear about something. This case is included here not because Liesl Ullman is a criminal in the conventional sense of the word, but because what happened to her, and what it took to undo it, is one of the most extraordinary intersections of law, injustice, and public outrage in Colorado history. The controversy alone demands it be told. Liesl Ullman was 21 years old in November 1997. She had grown up in the Denver area, and by her early 20s, she was in the process of extricating herself from a relationship and a social circle that had become dangerous. And the man she had been involved with was named Matthias Jaenig, described by those who knew him as volatile, erratic, and deeply unstable. By the time the events of November 12, 1997 unfolded, Ullman had reportedly broken off contact with Jaenig and was attempting to retrieve her belongings from an apartment where some of her things had been left behind. What was intended as a retrieval visit became something else. The events of that afternoon are reconstructed from witness accounts, any law enforcement records, and court testimony. Ullman arrived at the apartment with Jaenig and a group of others. A confrontation broke out. Reports indicate that members of the group, though not Ullman herself, were involved in a break-in at the property. When Denver police responded to a call about the disturbance, the situation escalated rapidly. Jaenig, armed, refused to comply. A high-speed chase ensued through Denver streets. Ullman in the vehicle, along with Jaenig and others. That ended when police managed to stop the car. Here is where the timeline becomes critical. Law enforcement removed Liesl Ullman from the vehicle and placed her in handcuffs. She was secured in the back of a police cruiser. She was, by every physical and legal definition, in custody. The chase was over for her. She was going nowhere. Matthias Jaenig was not yet secured. What happened next took less than a minute. Jaenig, still free and still armed, now opened fire on the officers surrounding the scene. Denver police officer Bruce Vanderjagt, a 14-year veteran of the force, was shot and killed. Vanderjagt was 45 years old, a father, a man his colleagues described as one of the steadiest presences on the department. He died on a Denver street while Liesl Ullman sat handcuffed in the back of a police car yards away, physically incapable of having done anything to stop what was happening or to have participated in it. Jaenig then turned the gun on himself and died at the scene. The legal theory under which Ullman was subsequently charged and convicted was Colorado's felony murder statute, a law that held that any participant in an underlying felony was criminally responsible for any death that occurred in the course of or flight from that felony, regardless of who pulled the trigger or whether the participant had any capacity to prevent the killing. Prosecutors argued that Ullman had participated in the break-in at the apartment, the underlying felony, and that Vanderjagt's death had occurred during the flight from that crime. Therefore, under the statute, she was as legally culpable as if she had fired the weapon herself. The jury, applying the law as it was written, and as the judge instructed them, convicted Liesl Ullman of first-degree felony murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 21 years old. She had been sitting in handcuffs when the officer died. The case might have remained in the dense, largely unread archives of Colorado criminal law. A troubling precedent, an uncomfortable verdict, but one that most people would never have heard of. were it not for a phone call that Auman's supporters made to a man named Hunter S. Thompson. Thompson was, by 1997, one of the most famous writers in America, the founder of gonzo journalism, the author of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, a man whose entire career had been built on confronting institutional power with the full force of his voice and his fury. He was living in Woody Creek, Colorado, not far from Aspen, when he was approached about Auman's case. He read the details. He became, by his own account, incensed. What Thompson did next was neither quiet nor subtle. He wrote extensively about the case, publishing pieces that framed Auman's conviction as a profound moral and legal failure, a system so drunk on its own statutes that it had imprisoned a handcuffed woman for a murder she was physically incapable of committing. He used his platform to make the case nationally visible. He helped organize a public rally in Denver in 2001 that drew thousands of people, a genuine street-level protest on behalf of a criminal conviction, anchored by one of the most recognizable literary figures in the country. The rally drew press coverage from across the nation. It drew attention to the felony murder statute in ways that forced Colorado lawmakers and legal scholars into a public reckoning with how the law was being applied. Thompson described the case in terms that his readers understood as a call to action, not on behalf of a hardened criminal, but on behalf of a young woman who had made poor choices in her personal life. Found herself in the wrong place with the wrong person, and been swallowed by a legal mechanism that was designed for something different than what it had been used to do to her. The Colorado Supreme Court agreed to hear Auman's case. In March 2005, the court overturned her conviction, ruling that the jury had been improperly instructed on the felony murder statute and that the instructions had failed to adequately account for the fact that Auman had been in police custody and therefore no longer in flight from the underlying felony. At the time, Officer Vanderjagt was killed. Yes, the legal logic that had imprisoned her for nearly 8 years was dismantled by the court's ruling with a precision that her supporters found vindicating and her critics found troubling in its implications for the felony murder doctrine. Auman was resentenced in 2005. She was given credit for time served. She was released. Officer Bruce Vanderjagt's family has navigated the decades since his death with the particular difficulty that comes when the legal resolution of a loved one's killing is complicated and contested, rather than clean and final. Vanderjagt died doing his job. He died because Matthias Janig shot him. Janig died at the scene, and the person who was ultimately held accountable, and then unheld accountable, was a 21-year-old woman in handcuffs who had been present for the beginning of a series of events she could not control and could not stop. Hunter S. Thompson died in February 2005, just weeks before the Colorado Supreme Court issued the ruling he had spent years working toward. He did not live to see Liesl Auman walk free. Whether he knew the ruling was coming before he died is a matter of biographical record that his friends and colleagues have addressed in the years since. What is not in dispute is that without his intervention, without the noise he made, the rally he organized, the words he wrote, the case might never have reached the court that ultimately freed her. Liesl Auman has lived her life outside of prison since 2005. She has spoken publicly about her experience on limited occasions. If the felony murder statute that was used to convict her remains in Colorado law, though its application has been a subject of ongoing legal debate in the years since her case, Bruce Vanderjagt remains dead. Matthias Janig remains dead. And somewhere in the space between those two facts and Liesl Auman's release is a question about what the law is actually for, and whether a statute applied perfectly to the letter can still produce an outcome that is wrong. Now, Colorado has never fully stopped asking that question. And if you think the most shattering moments in Colorado criminal history require adult perpetrators, premeditated plans, and years of building rage, the final case in this series began inside a school, involved 2 students, and ended with an act of heroism so instinctive and so complete that it left an entire nation struggling to find words equal to what Kendrick Castillo did in the last seconds of his life. Benny number 10, Devin Erickson and Alec McKinney. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a courtroom when a parent stands up to speak about a child who died saving someone else's life. It is different from every other kind of silence. It has weight. It has texture. It is the silence of a room full of people who understand, all at once, that they are in the presence of something that language was not built to fully carry. Kendrick Castillo was 18 years old on May 7, 2019, and he had 1 week left of his senior year at STEM school Highlands Ranch in Douglas County, Colorado. He had been accepted to college. He was, by every account from teachers and classmates and family, exactly the kind of young man that schools hope to produce. Curious, kind, quietly confident, with a particular passion for robotics and engineering that had already defined the shape of the future he was building for himself. His father, John Castillo, has described him in interviews as someone who never needed to be told to do the right thing. It was simply what he did. Devin Erickson was 18 years old in May 2019. He had attended STEM school Highlands Ranch and moved through its hallways with a social profile that peers later described to investigators as troubled and attention-seeking. Someone who performed an identity rather than inhabiting one. Cycling through aesthetic personas and expressing escalating grievances about classmates and the social dynamics of the school. His social media presence, reviewed extensively after the attack, showed someone increasingly absorbed in dark imagery and expressions of contempt for the people around him. He had told at least one person in the weeks before May 7th that he intended to do something that would make people pay attention to him. Alec McKinney was 16 years old, born female, and McKinney had come out as transgender in the period before the attack, a fact that would become, in the immediate aftermath of May 7th, the subject of a political firestorm that his own attorneys and many commentators argued was a profound and damaging distraction from the actual causes and circumstances of the shooting. McKinney had experienced what he described as sustained bullying and social rejection at the school, and he would later tell investigators and the court that Erickson had manipulated and coerced him into participation, that the planning had been Erickson's, and that McKinney had been drawn in through a combination of his own pain and Erickson's psychological pressure. Prosecutors disputed the extent of that framing. The evidence showed McKinney as an active participant, not a passive one. Together, on the morning of May 7, 2019, Erickson and McKinney brought concealed handguns into STEM school Highlands Ranch. They entered separate classrooms, and in the classroom where Devin Erickson opened fire, something happened that no plan, no tactical gear, no psychological preparation could have anticipated. Kendrick Castillo lunged at him, without hesitation, without calculation, without the milliseconds of frozen deliberation that most people experience when confronted with sudden violence, and Kendrick Castillo rose from his seat and moved directly toward the shooter. He was shot once at close range. He died in the classroom, but his action, instinctive, immediate, and total, disrupted the attack at its critical moment. Other students in the room tackled Erickson in the seconds that followed, subduing him before he could fire again. 8 other students were injured across the 2 classrooms. Our 8 people went home from STEM school Highlands Ranch that afternoon, in part because of what Kendrick Castillo did in the last seconds of his life. Law enforcement responded to the school within minutes. Both Erickson and McKinney were taken into custody at the scene. Police body cam footage from the arrests was later reviewed by investigators and, in portions, released publicly. The school was evacuated in the chaotic, fragmented way that has become grimly familiar in the era of American school shootings. Students streaming out with their hands up, some crying, some eerily calm, all of them carrying something they had not arrived with that morning. The national media response was immediate and enormous. Kendrick Castillo's name spread across every platform within hours. His photograph, a young man with a quiet smile and an obvious ease with himself, became the face of the coverage. His parents, John and Maria Castillo, gave interviews in the days that followed that were almost unbearable in their dignity. They did not perform grief. They carried it, visibly and without self-pity. And they spoke about their son with a specificity and warmth that made him real to people who had never met him. The political response was also immediate and significantly more complicated. At a public vigil held in the days following the attack, Colorado politicians arrived to speak. Some attempted to use the moment to advance gun control messaging. The crowd, which included students who had been inside STEM school Highlands Ranch on May 7th, erupted. Dozens of students and family members walked out of the vigil in protest, some of them shouting that the event had been turned into a political platform before the dead had even been buried. Video of the walkout spread globally and ignited a separate national conversation about the politics of grief. at the timing of policy advocacy, and who has the right to speak in the immediate aftermath of mass violence. Alec McKinney's transgender identity, once reported, generated a wave of commentary from political figures and media outlets on both sides of the culture war, some arguing it was relevant context, others arguing it was a cynical exploitation of a grieving community's tragedy. And Aunt McKinney's attorneys argued strenuously that the coverage had made a fair trial impossible and had fundamentally distorted public understanding of the case. The court ultimately determined that proceedings could continue. Devin Erickson's trial took place in 2020. He was convicted on all counts, including first-degree murder for the death of Kendrick Castillo and multiple counts of attempted murder. At sentencing, the courtroom heard from survivors, from parents, and from Kendrick's family. Eddie John Castillo spoke directly to Erickson. He described his son not as a victim, but as a hero. And he said it without performance, without theatrics, in the flat and steady voice of a man who had decided that the truth of who his son was would not be obscured by the circumstances of how he died. Erickson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Alec McKinney, tried as a juvenile despite the severity of the charges, was convicted in a separate proceeding on multiple counts including murder. Because McKinney was 16 at the time of the attack, the sentencing structure was different. He received a sentence that included the possibility of a parole hearing after a period of years, reflecting the legal framework Colorado applies to juvenile offenders even in the most serious cases. That sentencing distinction drew its own wave of controversy, with victims' families expressing deep dissatisfaction with the outcome. Devin Erickson is currently serving life without parole in a Colorado correctional facility. Alec McKinney is serving his sentence within the juvenile and young adult correctional framework. Kendrick Castillo is buried in Colorado. His parents established the Kendrick Castillo Memorial Scholarship Fund in his name, all designed to support students pursuing engineering, the field their son had loved and had been preparing to spend his life in. STEM school, Highlands Ranch, reopened. Students returned. The building where Kendrick died continued to hold classes, because buildings continue to hold classes, because life continues forward even when it feels like it shouldn't be able to. The robotics equipment that Kendrick had worked with is still there. His name is on a scholarship. His photograph is in the hallway of a school that exists in part because of what he chose to do on a Tuesday morning with 1 week left of his senior year. There are 10 cases in this series, 10 moments where ordinary life in Colorado collapsed into something irreversible, 10 sets of victims whose names deserve to be said aloud and remembered, 10 perpetrators whose choices echo outward in ways that do not diminish with time, and running through all of them, the courthouse steps. Use the crime scene tape, the vigils and the verdicts, and the sentences handed down in rooms full of people carrying grief they did not ask for, is the same unanswerable question that every true crime story eventually arrives at. Not just what happened, not just who did it, but what it costs, what it keeps costing, and whether the systems we build to contain the worst of human behavior are ever truly equal to the weight of what they are asked to hold.